Hello, this is Brett Etheridge with Dominate the GMAT, here with your GMAT tip of the week. The tip of the week for this week is always draw a figure if none is given. If it makes sense to do so, of course. What I mean by that is if you're just looking at a basic algebra problem where you're supposed to solve for x, you don't necessarily need to draw a figure. But sometimes you'll be looking at a GMAT word problem that's all text, and yet it will help you if you actually draw a figure. So that in itself hopefully is helpful, but what's more important is if you're going to bother to actually draw a figure, you might as well draw it to scale. And here's why, and here's what I mean by that. First things first. Let's say you're looking at a word problem that's all text that says something like a rectangular garden is laid out such that the diagonal of the garden is twice as long as the shorter side. And then it goes on to talk about more features of the garden, and it's going to ask you some sort of question. At that point, you may think to yourself, well, it would actually help me if I could draw a figure. And so not only do you want to draw a figure of a rectangular garden, but you want to go ahead and draw it to scale. And here's how. On your scratch paper, you'll have paper, something that you can use to actually use as kind of like a key. And so, for example, let's say we go ahead and just arbitrarily designate something like that, maybe the side of a paper, or maybe put a little tick mark or something to say, okay, that's going to be a side of my garden. Now the problem says that the diagonal of this garden is twice as long as the shorter side. So what I'm going to do is, rather than arbitrarily drawing it, let's actually make sure the diagonal is twice as long. So there's one, but now we got to do a second one. Right? And you can obviously do that however you would want. But then at that point, now we actually know that the proportions are going to be correct. So at that point, now my rectangle is a little bit contorted. You don't want to waste too much time being too exact, but what you do want to make sure is that the dimensions are going to fit what the problem's telling you. I think this will be helpful, especially because why? Well, remember, if you have a figure that's drawn to scale, now you can eyeball. Let's say it asks about one of the angles. What is the measure of that angle? Well, you may recognize that what has been described is a 30, 60, 90 right triangle, but even if you're not recognizing that, the fact that we have now drawn a figure, you could eyeball that, right? It's certainly less than 45 degrees, and then based on the answer choices, you can certainly eliminate some wrong answer choices, and maybe again, by eyeballing, say, hey, if this is 90 degrees, that's probably about 30 degrees there. So again, you can use the figure now that it's drawn to scale to approximate, to eyeball certain things if you had to. Maybe it also puts you in a position to know how to do the geometry, but the tip again is this. If you have a word problem with no figure actually given and it makes sense to do so, draw a figure always. And specifically, if you're going to bother to do so, you might as well draw it to scale. Hopefully this helps. Go out, dominate the GMAT, and we'll see you next week for next week's tip of the week.